Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Derek Piet here. I'm a product management director at PTC, and I'll be followed shortly along by another Derek Marino, who will be providing you a demonstration. Today's topic, as Denise mentioned, about practical interoperability, managing and exchanging requirements with our PTC integrity-based requirements connector, is really meant to show you how can you leverage requirements internally between multiple requirement management systems and the interoperability and exchange process of how that goes through. So the plan for today is to go some of the challenges that may exist in this space, why you'd be doing this interoperability and exchanging of requirements, overview of what the PTC Integrity Requirements Connector is, and then Derek Marino is going to take you through a live demonstration of the use cases that we are going to talk about here in the overview, and he's going to show you a good way of how a DOORS requirements management system and an integrity lifecycle management system really functions with the requirements connector exchange process. So, what is the reason for you need interoperability of requirements? So let's take this example. If you're familiar with the system engineering V diagram, this will look obviously very similar to you. It's somewhat based on that process. And what you can assume here is that there's really two levels of information with two different environments. And when I mean environments, two different companies, could be two different business units, could be a supplier and an OEM relationship. Think of that a domain space. It doesn't have to be within one company or across two companies, but it could be either. And the first three levels here, so the product level documentation, system level documentation, and component level documentation, is defined, elaborated, created in one system with a number of different relationships between those for traceability, decomposition, verification processes, as well as eventual connectivity to the product information. The second is that when it gets to at some point, I'll use an OEM and supplier relationship, we need to hand off, or the company that does the product level and component level and system level documentation needs to outsource or provide a set of information, instructions, material, documentation to their supplier in order for them to deliver printed circuit board, subsystem, braking system, electronic control systems, whatever those may be. And so there needs to be some form of a contractual exchange of what are you going to build, and I agree, or here's some refinement needs to happen. So the challenges there are how do you effectively communicate changes that may exist from the supplier back to the OEM or the owner that provided you with that contract, as well as how can you then provide efficient and consistent test verifications if you're not sure what the supplier is actually providing with you. So the purpose of that is the need for exchanging requirements in a better way is really necessary. This could be done, of course, with email, could be done with Word documents, spreadsheets, other informal methodologies and approaches. The problem is, are you speaking the same language? Will you be able to communicate that information effectively? Will it be able to tie to your downstream systems that need to implement these product information? Or maybe upstream CRM or bug tracking systems that need to be fed back to your original customers that are defining or providing you with information. So the connectivity of those requirements is not just within the two different OEM and supplier relationship. It's also to a much broader, maybe it needs to be a governing body. How can you prove that you have implemented something according to a safety standard or a compliance standard? And some of that information obviously is being designed and developed by an external supplier. So you need to really make this information part of your overall product development process, even though you are not directly either creating it or you're not the direct implementer of it. And so what was the methodology within the industry to think about this process? And before a standards-based approach was considered for exchanging requirements between OEM and supplier, or in the graphic here, partner 1 and partner 2, obviously there were a number of different ways that those things were done. So let's look at the graphic here. On the left-hand side and the right-hand side are basically requirement management systems managing detailed specifications, documents, and those could be customer ones, those could be detailed specifications, and so forth. And so the methodology was partner 1 creates a document and then has to export it to partner 2. Partner 2 takes it in, somehow has to figure out how to import it. If it's the same, if they're the same tools, that's probably not too bad. If they're different tools, then they have to export it into Excel or some consumable format that's consistent and agreed upon between the two organizations. And then they import it into their requirements management system because they use a different one than partner 1. And they want to be able to now realize some of the detailed elements that were exchanged from partner 1. And so they take them, put them in their requirements management tool, but they also have some changes that need to be implemented. They want to change some language, they want to change some specifications, whatever those may be, some dimensions, potentially attributes, and they have to now send it back to partner 1. So this loop of exchange, essentially either an import or export process, needs to be done. And anytime you're going through a non-formal or non-standard-based approach, there's obviously always a potential loss of information that may be done through either import, through the export process. You may not have the level of fidelity you may need when you import it back. You may be using different procedures for associating one ID in tool A and another unique ID in tool B. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. It can be done, but typically there's a heavy manual effort required to keep these things consistent and realizable for future exchanges, because that process is not going to happen once. Contractual agreements or exchanges of information are going to happen numerous amounts of times. And so what happened is a governing body was essentially formed several years ago that worked on how do we define a standards way to exchange requirements consistently between two different applications, or the same application maybe in two different organizations, two different partners. So you could think of requirements tool A and requirements tool B here as the same requirement system, or different requirement systems in different buildings, different, in one company maybe an air gap, so on network versus off network, or can two different companies. So a dedicated format was developed to exchange that information to realize when you import or export requirements to the system, define a standard ontology, nomenclature, and format for exchanging that data. And this was really formed through what we call the RecIF standard file format, or what was previously known years ago as a RIF format, and became more formalized and more organized with the RecIF standard. And so what that did is that an implementer forum came up with this approach, which is inclusive of both vendors and suppliers. In this case, the methodology for that idea is that interoperability of these requirements was challenging, and the governing bodies that are consumers or producers of this information, or companies that are the actual providers of the requirements management solutions, need to be able to come up with a common way to work together. How does BMW effectively communicate requirements that Continental has to implement in their OEM and supplier relationship? And same is true for all those using both IBM and PTC applications, for example, for requirements management in each system or in each company. And so the goal of this is a standards approach, kind of governed through the ProStep organization to look at how can this forum be both providers of tools and customers themselves to facilitate a communication, governing standards, and a way that these things can be effectively tested and validated so that there's consistency between the usage of information. And so one thing to really also talk about is there's different types of interoperability. What we're talking about here is a contractual exchange outside of an organization. Now, there are different ways to think about how requirements need to be associated or connected to each other or to other systems. And some of those standards you may hear about in the industry today is OSLC, where you want to link requirements to other requirement artifacts or to other information in a different system. And what that comes to is there's always a need and there's always a value in multiple standards to satisfy the goal. What is the business goal you're trying to satisfy? When you're contractually exchanging requirements between OEM and supplier, you're not working on the same system, so you can't really link that information to each other. However, if you're working within a company, then the value that OSLC provides to connect different requirements can also be leveraged as well. So how do you have requirements tied to your test information within your own company? So when you have the ability to interact between your two different systems or within the systems that you own, then there's a different value. You're not exchanging requirements. It's not a replication of content or an import-export process. More about how do you handle connectivity. So there's needs for both use cases, and more than happy to have a conversation about those types of use cases where connectivity and traceability is one aspect, but contractual and importing exporting processes are also useful as well. So with that, let's go into a little bit more about the application that we provide. So the PTC requirements connecting. Some people may know what it is on the phone here, and some people may not. So to level set the methodology, PTC acquired a company about a year ago named Atigo, and over time they've acquired a number of other companies. And the application, now known as the Integrity Requirements Connector, came through a number of those acquisitions. It has been around for a number of years, working in many of PTC's common customer base for taking just that use case I talked about in exchanging a OEM and supplier or a partner-in-partner communication. It's been used in between two different business units for exchanging that may use different requirements management systems, but they want to use a common set of standards requirements. They all want to satisfy, maybe CE standards or some federal regulation standards that are written, but they don't want to have them, they don't share a common library because they use different systems. Or, of course, between different business partners, which is another example of how that exchange process works. What are the primary use cases that the application is meant to solve? And there are really four key ones. The first one is this idea of collaborative development, which I kind of explained it already. How can an OEM and a supplier develop a product, a subsystem, a component, a system effectively and exchange collaborative information around their requirement information? What are they going to build? Is it clear? Is it agreed upon? How do you handle that? The second one is more to the last slide. How do different sites that potentially use different requirement management tools or tools that are not connected to each other exchange a common set of requirements? Standards-based requirements, company-defined requirements. Maybe it's a common color as an example that has to be satisfied in every department. I know that's true for some industrial companies. This idea of reusability of requirements. So you're going to either move from one requirements management system to another, so we want to reuse those requirements, or I have different projects and programs that want to leverage requirements from different requirements management systems, so I want to reuse those requirements in mine, maybe coming up with a new product, but I know my other division has already satisfied some of those requirements, so I want to reuse them in my system. And the last one is another interesting aspect of archival. So if you use one application today, you don't know what you need to use maybe 20 or 30 years later. If you have the need or governmental regulations or federal regulations to maintain data for an X amount of time or keep it because your product lives in the field for very long periods of time. So you either need to archive or manage that information. And if you can do that and handle that information in a standards-based way, you are more likely to be able to import it or reuse it later. And so archival could be done from a standards-based approach so you can manage that information. Now let's go through a simple kind of scenario of what this might look like. This is a little bit more graphic than that kind of sketch diagram you saw at the beginning that the RecIF conference was really putting forth for how do you handle this. But here's kind of a flow, and this flow will help when you see Derek Marino's demonstration in a few moments here. It'll give you some context for how that process methodology works. So let's assume I have these kind of computer diagrams on the left are really requirement management systems. And so if we assume requirement management system A and B, one on the left, one on the right, and they need to exchange those requirements, but they can't do it in a standard way, or they don't do it very efficiently in exporting out requirements to be consumed by another application. So the requirements connector is used to extract the requirements from the system and develop and maintain it and create a requirement or a RecIF standard-based requirements format. That requirement format can then be somehow sent to your supplier. We'll use the left-hand side of the screen, the OEM, and the right-hand side is the supplier. However you get to them, to that supplier. Do you mail it to them? Do you share a common repository? Do you share a common FTP site? Is there a portal that you exchange that information to them? Obviously, there's a number of different ways you can get data to your OEM or your supplier. They take it, that package, which is definitely going to be much smaller than a export out of the database that you already have, and it's going to be more rich in information. It's not just a simple set of or a general list that you may have in Excel file. It's going to be a lot more contextual in nature as well. And you're going to take that and you're going to import that into your requirements management system, which may be the same or may be different, maybe even a different version as the other application as well. But because you're standardizing the exchange process with a standard format, you can do this. However, as a supplier, I'm going to tweak those requirements. Maybe I need to add some comments. Maybe I don't, or I can't satisfy one of those requirements. Maybe I have some new ideas and requirements that you want to consider. So then what do? I do the exact same process. I export it out. I send it back. The requirements connector recognizes the differential between what was sent by the OEM and what the supplier said and says, you know what, we only need to work on just this differential in our database, or we only need to update those in our requirement system. So let's just take that differential, update that information, and be able to visualize what the differences are between what I sent and what the supplier is sending back to me. And of course, this process is going to go round and round, given the number of changes that may exist, or the number of suggestions, or the number of maybe agreement or lack of agreement, for that matter, between them. And so how frequent you exchange is really depend on, the level of acceptance of these requirements. And that's simplistically the flow. There's a lot more content that happens in there, but that's essentially the flow. You're probably doing this today whenever you send something to your supplier or your OEM and back and try to come with agreement. But how are you doing it? Is it an efficient process? Is it can you track, can you change, understand what those changes are? Do you lose any fidelity of information? How rich does that information really get exchanged? And so with that, we're going to transition over to Derek Marino now, who's going to give you a very good demonstration about how the product functions and a lot more, I'll say, meat to the bone, that which I've tried to elaborate here in slides. So with that, Derek?
Okay, great. I appreciate everyone in the audience giving us some of your time today. So as Derek said, we're going to walk through just a simple scenario today, and I'll replay just this last slide where we're going to talk about two fictitious business partners. I'll just call them generically Business Partner A and Business Partner B, and for whatever reason is going on in their environment, perhaps they're two separate corporations with a firewall in between, perhaps it's a single corporation where you've got a general use network and a classified lab type network where there's no live integration there. For whatever reason, there's no network connection between the two. So we'll extract some information out of our first requirements tool, which happens to be IBM Doors. We'll transfer that or simulate transferring that over to Integrity Lifecycle Manager, which is PTC's ALM offering. For those of you who may be familiar with PTC Integrity, that name is now sort of the family umbrella name for all of our ALM offerings. Integrity Lifecycle Manager is the one for requirements, change management, test management, source code management, that type of thing. You may hear me refer to it as ILM or just Integrity, but that's what I'm referring to. So we'll bring that in. We'll make a few simple changes just to illustrate that, and then we'll push that back to the original DOORS repository and see how those differentials are propagated back in our environment. And for the demonstration today, I'm really going to take it from the typical end user's perspective. This is going to be kind of the general workflow that an end user of DOORS or an end user of Integrity would do, the buttons, the mouse clicks they would make. We're not really going to get into any of the administrative side of things today. Maybe that's a good discussion for another session or for follow-up conversations. Okay. So where I'm going to start today is just illustrating first what data we're working with. And to start that, let me put on a hat of someone in the Business Partner A's environment. And Business Partner A is using IBM DOORS for their data. And so what we've got in here is just a simple example project with 3 DOORS documents. In DOORS terminology, they call them modules. We have a systems requirement document, sort of a parent level document. And underneath that, there's a software specification and a hardware specification, okay, 2 children, if you will. There are some traceability links from the parent to the children. So going from systems to software, systems to hardware, there are DOORS links of type satisfy. I've also created some DOORS links just within, looping back to itself, the system requirements of type related. So if I open that up and take a look here, I'll change my view. Let's say I've got a hypothetical view here of approved requirements, things that my internal team have okayed and said, okay, let's send these off to the supplier to see what they can do with them for our specific subsystem. But we'll see here that, again, just for purposes of simplicity and time, we've got headings, the text here, we've got some graphics. We could have different types of attributes over here on the right, whether system, DOORS system, or user-defined. I'll be talking about attributes a little bit later on in the demo. Right now, just to keep it simple. And I'm going to focus on the section 2.1 here, the acoustic requirements, simply because it's a small requirement item and it's close to the top, so I'm not doing a lot of scrolling around. But we see that there's a traceability link down to the software design spec document. And so we can open that as well. And we see that that document, in turn, has some information in here, as well as it's got some column attributes that have been pre-created. In this scenario, we've already sent these documents over to our supplier in the past, so what we're doing is sending them an update with some deltas. All right, so I'll close that. And then on the Business Partner B side, let's say Business Partner B is using PTC Integrity for requirements management. We have those same 3 documents that have already been exchanged over. So if we open that up, we can see that we've got that same high-level requirements document with all of the information in there. And what I'm looking at right now is just a column context, or if you're a DOORS user, it'd be somewhat akin to a view of just a basic authored view. I've created another column context, what I call tracing, that has some additional information I'll show you here in a moment. And if we look at that same section 2.1, for the acoustic requirements, we see that the traceability is already over here, as we had seen in the past, as well as some object identifier information from DOORS, and then some other things called PTC connector changes and conflicts. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the demo. To be able to navigate the traceability in here is just a matter of going through and doing a view document, and that'll bring up the document at the other end of that link. Very similar. So as I go through the rest of this demo, I'm going to make the assumption that the audience members have at least a basic level of experience or familiarity, both with the DOORS tool and with Integrity Lifecycle Manager. The purpose of today is really not to go into a deep demo of either of these technologies. We have some additional pre-recorded web seminars that are available on ptc.com, as well as some upcoming seminars later this summer of Integrity Lifecycle Manager and some of the other tools, and we'll be touching on those towards the end of the demonstration. But rather, the purpose of today is just to focus on that integration technology in between. All right. So putting on the hat of my business partner A, my doors user, if I will, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to make some changes. My team has gotten together and we've decided that for the system we're designing, we really need to make a few changes, and specifically we're going to make changes to the acoustics area. So what I do in here as a normal doors user, something I've probably been trained to do over time, is make the changes. And I say, well, okay, in this example, there are 3 different acoustic sound power levels, and now we're changing this to 7 different acoustic levels. And I'll go ahead and I'll add a new requirement in here as well. So in addition to being defined for different ambient temperatures and loading conditions, let me do it this way, and we'll go in here so it doesn't. They are defined by altitude as well. Some new change in here. Okay, so our new requirement, and I'll go ahead and save those. Now, for a more complex scenario, which can be supported by IRC requirements connector, you'll hear me refer to, we could also delete requirements. We could refactor our documents, which involves actually moving requirements or the structure, the headings and subheadings, sections, subsections around. For simplicity today, I'm just going to change one and modify one here. And then we're going to send this over to our supplier to see if they think that any changes to the design spec, the children documents, need to be made. But before I do that, as a good practice, what I'd like to do is I'm going to create a baseline of this document. Generally saying it's a good practice if you're going to share something with someone else to take a snapshot of it so that if there are any changes that are made, it's pretty apparent to you if you get it back. So I'll just create a new baseline. I've already had one here created earlier in my dev cycle, so I'll just call this one 0.2 and we'll call it for review. The creation of a baseline is not necessary, but it's just general good practice, and so I'm going to do that. Okay, we see that those things have been baselined. Any other changes that need to be made, we can make those as well if need be. So now, pardon me, as that user, I open up IRC. So IRC is a utility that runs on the desktop, and it can run in a couple of different modes. So if you're in an environment or a development situation where you're, let's say, for example, a primary supplier working with, a primary integrator working with multiple suppliers, and you're sending multiple organizations similar or the same sets of requirements, IRC can be configured so that the repository side, where the data is stored, can be managed in an Oracle database. And this gives a very fine-grained control over the configuration of the requirements or information that you give to supplier A versus B versus C. I'm using it in more of a desktop mode since I've just got one business partner that I'm transferring information with back and forth. And in fact, in desktop mode, my local workspace is just in this folder that I've put on the desktop. But what I've done here is I've opened up a tab that holds the configuration for how I will extract information out of doors and send it to my business partner. So I've got my connection here, and I'm going to export data. And I see here up on top, I've actually already got the direct connection. This utility, IRC, actually makes a live API connection into the various requirement management tools in order to do the queries and extract the information. So to do that, all I need to do is add whatever documents are existing in my, let's say, doors database into IRC, point them together. I've already got that. And what I can do here is if I open up the Twisty, I'll see that I've got the information that I'm going to be pulling out, the object heading, the object identifier, and the text, as well as the link information that was pre-existing in doors. I've got the opportunity down here to choose the last baseline that I have or an earlier baseline. So if I actually am going to do a little bit of a refresh here so I can see that not .2. grab that. Yeah, grab 0.2 baseline. And then what view do I want to pull information from? So I'm just going to pull it from that doors view that I had created of approved requirements. Okay. I'll do a little bit of a validation check, and this checks some of the logic and configuration behind the scenes to make sure everything's okay. And I'll do an export. So I'll just say export for transfer to partner B, whatever comments I want to do. And of course, we're using the RecIF standard. So now what it's doing is it's querying, going into Doors Live, and looking at the specific modules that I told it to find, and then tracing or going and grabbing all of the requirement items out of it. When it's done pulling that information out, it provides me with a little bit of an audit report on the back end. So we've got a line-by-line audit record of all the exports I've done in the past. If I go down here, we can see a little bit more information. So these are the Doors modules that I've got, the object count, and the time. So you'll see here, we pulled about 300 different requirement objects out of Doors, including graphics and including traceability, and it probably took us just a tick over 10 seconds or so. The really important stuff is here in the upper right-hand corner. So we've got an exchange summary, which is an RTF version of this audit window down here. And then we've got the RecIF zip folder or RecIF archive. This would be the actual file that you would place on your floppy or thumb drive or burn to DVD or secure FTP, what have you, and then send over to your business partner. That is a self-contained blob with all of the information in it. So now, as a Doors end user, I'm done. I put that in the the folder section where my partner can pick it up, and I can exit from here. Okay. So we'll close out of that. So now, if you'll allow me, I'll actually change my hat, and I'll put on the hat of Business Partner B. Business Partner B is comprised of a team using Integrity Lifecycle Manager for their requirements management, and they want to be able to get this information in, analyze it, make changes, like I said, and send it back. So they also have a configuration for how IRC interacts with Integrity on their side. Now, for those of you who might be familiar a bit with Integrity, there's one extra just bit here, without going too much inside baseball, that I do want to touch on. Integrity Lifecycle Manager handles document types a little bit differently than Doors. And what I mean by that is in Doors, a Doors module is a Doors module is a Doors module. You can label it requirements, you can label it design spec, you could label it test, but that module container is fairly generic. On the Integrity side, there's a stronger typing of the different types, different kinds of documents that you can have here. So I've created a mapping configuration here, all point and click through the GUI, for requirement specification document as well as a design specification document. There's nothing magic about these two names here. IRC will look into your Integrity infrastructure, into your server, and see what type of documents you have pre-created and then populate them here for you. Okay. Just wanted to mention that. But if I look at that configuration for how I'm going to actually exchange the RecIF data, we'll see that it looks very familiar. Very similar to what we had on the other end. We've got our configuration for connection, and so I'll go ahead and I'll activate the connection. So I got a live look into Integrity. Okay, here. My hard drive is just grinding for a moment. Okay. And here on the Import tab, I'm going to define what documents I'm going to pull in. So to do that, I would take that RecIF blob file that I got from Business Partner A, put it somewhere on a shared drive on my desktop, what have you. I happen to know that that blob file is located in this folder, and I'll simply add that document either from the file system or from my local workspace. So I know where this is located, and I'll just navigate down through my structure, and I'll see that I've got those three documents that we were looking at earlier today. The folders that you see accompanying those three documents are actually subfolders holding any OLE objects or file attachments that have also come across with the RecIF information. And I'll click OK. Okay, so it's loading those up. We'll give that just a moment. And now there's a couple of things that I can see here. As I go through, I see that from my system documents, I've got the doors identifier, the text, and the heading. From my software and design specification, pardon me, I've just got that text and heading. Down here, I've already checked off some options, and maybe these things are agreed upon checks, kind of an informal governance that I've set up with business partner A. I want to allow IRC to create, delete, or move objects if there are any deltas in the RecIF files. And I also want to be able to track those changes. So what we'll see here as I go into the integrity tool, there'll be extra columns off to the right that show me what's changed as I'm updating things over time. A couple other things I can do as just little edits before I actually run the import is look into the XML files. RecIF is really just an XML schema, if you will. So if I wanted to look into that to see what's in there ahead of time, I've got a couple of built-in tools with IRC, and I'll just use the system requirements as an example. So highlight that, and let me take a look at, I'll do open with my RecIF viewer. So what I'm looking at now is just a parsing of that actual RecIF file. It really doesn't give any of the style information or the graphics, but if I just want to look at the basic text, the basic parsing of the RecIF file itself, this is a nice way to view things. I can also look at the attribute definitions of the data that's come over and the base data types themselves. So that's one nice thing that's in there. If I'm really an XML or RecIF aficionado and I want to go deep into the code, maybe I want to look at the XML itself. So the IRC's got the built-in sort of text viewer here where you can associate it with a system, a Windows text editor. For example, Notepad++ or WordPad, or if you're using Ultra Edit, something like that. But I can go through here and look at the XML itself. Definitely not recommend hand changing any of the XML, but if you want to look at it, that's just fine. So a couple different ways to check things out here. Once I'm satisfied that the information is what I want, simply choose Import Documents, and we'll run that. Actually, let me run a validate on this side just to make sure I've got my green check marks, checking the logic and the configuration, and we'll run import. And we'll just say from business partner A. Okay. So we're running an update here, and this update is going to take, I don't know, about a minute or so. I've run this previous, so I have a good idea of how long it's going to take. And I'll just describe to you kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So IRC is querying into Integrity, into the requirements management tool. It's looking at the documents specifically in the RecIF files, and it's traversing through each requirement item by item to see if there are any changes to it. If so, what are those changes? Does my user have permission to make an update to that item? Or is there a new traceability link that has been created or deleted since then? It's making those changes. What it's also doing is if there is a new attribute that would have been created from business partner A that does not yet exist on business partner B, and obviously the user has permissions, it will go and automatically create that attribute for you and make it visible to the relevant document types. So, and it can do that both ways. All right, so we have the update. We have our audit window here with our quick audit. We've got an exchange summary, which is kind of, again, an RTF format of this window here. And then we have a couple of other formats here. Were there any conflicts? A conflict is defined as, let's say that I have a requirement item that was given to me last week and has been updated today. Is going to be updated today, but in the meantime, I've made some changes to that same base requirement. So now we've got kind of a conflict, a potential conflict for which one gets overwritten which. If there was that case happening, it would report that there was a conflict. Pretty quiet, no conflicts here today. But then it also has a differential type of thing, so we could scroll down here and look to see just in an HTML format what the differences were. So the important thing that I want to do right now is, as I've got my integrity hat on, I'll go, oops, sorry, wrong tool. This is the one I wanted. We'll go in and we'll take a look at this. So we can see here now down at my acoustic level requirements, we've got a couple of things. We've got what was previously 3 different acoustic levels is now 7. We've got over here on the right-hand side a little bit of an attribute column that shows the changes, the from and the to. And then as we scroll down, we have the new one that's been created there, defined by altitude as well. Nothing left here, it just says it's created, and that's great. That's exactly what we're expected to see. Well, me as business partner B or the supplier in this scenario say, well, there's some changes here, and I as the intelligent engineer need to go in and kind of rectify some of these changes. So to do that, I'm actually going to go down to my software level requirements. So I'll just navigate down from the one that's changed. And it navigates me directly to the requirement in question. We'll see that I've got a suspect link upstream, which is what I would expect from a good requirements management system, that if something changes on either end of the traceability link, it gets suspect. Pardon me. And let's say I make some changes for 7 new levels. And I'll say a new spec for my new requirement. Okay? In addition to that, what I'll probably want to do is, let's say I'll create a traceability link from this spec back to that requirement. Oh, and before I do that, I think that this is okay. The changes shouldn't be too bad, so I'm going to clear that suspect link. This is the one. Clear it. And we see that we've got the cleared suspect link here. So now to create traceability in ILM, give myself a little bit more real estate here. And what we'll do is we'll just create a quick traceability link, and we'll click OK. So now we've got traceability. As I said, this is not meant to be a big full demo of Integrity Lifecycle Manager. We'll be handling that in some other web sessions. But I think the idea of editing requirements and creating trace links is pretty broadly accepted across folks using these type of tools. So we've got our links, and now we've got the changes. And now what I want to do is I want to bundle these things back up, send them back to business partner B. I'll close my document and go back to IRC. So now in IRC, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to export this information, and I can export it based on a past baseline if I've got one created, or I can create a baseline after the export is done. I'm going to leave that as is for now. And I'm just going to run my validation and export. And so it's bundling these things back up, creating that recif blob file, and allowing me to put it where I need to go. Back to the system integrator, SI. So it's going into Integrity now. It's grabbing all of those requirements from those documents, looking at the changes, and populating that. And when we're done here in just a moment, we'll see that we've got a similar recif file that we can send back up. There we go. Okay, successful export. We have our summary, and we have our recif file. And so now, as the Integrity user, I'm done. I can go back to my other parts of my day job, or do what it is I need to do. So now finally, the last part of the demonstration is I'm going to put my business partner A or my doors user hat back on so that I can pull that recif file back in and look at kind of a diff merge of what's been added or what's been changed. So to do that, I'll go back to my doors configuration where I started, and I will have saved, I've received the zip file, the recif file, I'll have saved it to my desktop or some location, and I'll make my connection into doors. All right, we've got that. We've got our import tab. so because we're pulling information back into doors now. And we want to point IRC at those new files. I happen to know where those are living in my file system, so I'll just navigate to that directly. All three of them I want. And we'll see that we've got them here. And I have the same options to be able to track changes, create, delete, move, links, or objects as needed. I'll just do a quick validation. It looks like it's good. Now, before I pull that back in, I want to show one other type of editor that's actually quite neat and that's built into IRC, and this is a kind of a differential rec-if editor. If I want to be able to look at that new set of rec-if files that I just received and compare them to the originals that I sent out, I can actually do that directly from within the tool. And to do that, I'm going to open up my, my project here, or you would navigate to where these files would exist in your file system. And I'm going to look first at the old one that I sent originally. And we'll just look at the system requirements one as an example. And I'm going to open it up with my difference viewer. All right. And now it's saying, well, okay, Derek, what would you like to compare it to? And I'll browse, and I'll compare it to the new one. And I happen to know where that one is living on my file system as well. And evaluate the difference. So now what I've got here built into the system is a way, either by the, I can sort it by the unique identifier to see what all the differences were made, or if I want to look at it through the strict document hierarchy, just the same information, a little bit different way of seeing the data, I can go through in an XML parsing type way, I can see what changes have been made. Once I'm satisfied that at that initial level that the differences are okay, I'll pull that data back into doors. Okay, and this will take, again, about 1 minute, maybe a bit less. So what we're doing now is IRC is going into doors, it's looking at the appropriate modules, it's doing a comparison of each module, and then if there are differences, it's updating only the ones that have changed. So the update sequence is generally much quicker than the initial populate sequence, if you will. We've got our conflict, our differential, and our import reports, similar to what we saw today. And I can close this out, but most importantly, as the doors user, I can go into doors, and see that I've got the requirements that I initially set here. I can navigate down to my software requirement specification and see that my business partner B, perhaps it's my supplier, has made the appropriate changes or the appropriate traceability links that satisfy whatever changes I sent to them. Now if we go and look at the, say, PTC changes view of information, we can see that the tool has automatically created and populated a couple of views for us. Pardon me. And I will scroll down. Here it is. The 7 new levels. We can see what the text was and what it is. And we can see that I have a new created requirement along with the links here. So this is just a very simple scenario showing information being sent from A to B, changed, and then sent back. IRC supports a multitude of scenarios that can be much more complex, where perhaps I'm sharing information with multiple business partners, or perhaps some documents I own and govern, and some documents my business partner owns and governs. How are those things managed back and forth? IRC can support those use cases as well. Now, in addition to the tool itself, and something that generally is important, is the approach and the governance, as I said, by which you use these type of tools. And this is where PTC can help, in addition to just the software, installation bits, licensing, and that type of things. What are the best collaboration practices that you would want to set up with and agree to with your business partners? We have experience in that area, so we can help you organize that information as well. I hope this demonstration was useful, this very simple scenario. If you'd like to have further information, obviously, you can contact your local PTC team. There are a variety also of webcasts that we have around Integrity Lifecycle Manager, as well as IRC, And Derek, I believe, here's a slide talking about an upcoming web session and later in August that has some of our other portfolio offerings.
Yes, Derek, that's correct. In fact, I'll be providing yet another webinar next month, towards the end of the month, which will actually showcase the value and the connectivity that we are offering between our modeler tool, which basically does system and software modeling domain spaces, and our Integrity Lifecycle Manager tool, which, as Derek Marino showed a few moments ago, is our requirements management, test management, and software configuration change management system. And so this webinar will focus on the connectivity of model-based systems engineering in the context of managing requirements, obviously in a requirements management tool, but how do those translate and how are they interoperable with a model that's done in a system modeling or software modeling domain.